You are listening to The Soul's Quiet Call, written by Akumah and voiceover by Sara.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 1, The Flower of the Soul. The small coastal town of Denori was wrapped in the quiet embrace of the morning fog. The air, thick with the scent of jasmine and rose, carried with it a soft melancholy, as if the world had forgotten to rush here. The cobblestone streets were still damp from the night's drizzle, and the ocean murmured just beyond the town, its waves brushing against the shore like the whispers of forgotten dreams. Meera sat in the back of her tiny flower shop, the gentle chime of the doorbell marking the arrival of her first customer. Her fingers moved deftly, picking up the soft petals of a rose, arranging them carefully into a bouquet. The movement was a dance she had performed countless times, calm, measured, and precise. The shop was small, tucked away in a corner of the town square, its windows always open to the salty breeze. Inside, the scent of fresh blooms enveloped everything, the earthy smell of daisies, the sweet perfume of lilies, and the intoxicating fragrance of lavender. The walls were lined with vases of every shape and size, each holding a different arrangement. Some were for special occasions, others for those who simply wanted a little beauty in their lives. Meera's shop was a quiet sanctuary, a place where people came to express their love, their sorrow, and their gratitude in the language of flowers. But Meera was not just a florist. She had a gift, one she did not ask for, one that often felt more like a curse. She could see people's deepest desires, their hidden yearnings, simply by looking into their eyes. It was as if their souls laid bare themselves before her, offering up their most intimate secrets. She had never shared this with anyone. No one knew that when she handed over a bouquet of roses to a bride, she could feel the bride's fear of inadequacy, the yearning to be loved not just for who she was, but for who she wanted to be. When she arranged a bunch of lilies for a funeral, she could see the family members' guilt, their regrets for the things they had never said, never done. The weight of it all had driven her to a quiet solitude. Over the years, she had learned to keep a distance from everyone. The pain in their eyes, their silent cries for things they could not have, weighed too heavily on her heart. She had learned to mask it, of course. Her smile was always warm, her hands steady as she worked. But inside, she was alone. She wondered if anyone ever really looked at her, not for her gentle hands or the way she arranged flowers with such grace, but for who she truly was. The bell rang again, snapping Meera from her thoughts. A man stepped into the shop, his figure tall and broad, with dark hair that brushed against his collar. His presence filled the room, though he didn't seem to notice it. He was looking down at a piece of paper, his eyes furrowed in concentration. "Excuse me," he said, lifting his gaze. "I'm looking for something special." Meera's heart skipped. The weight of his gaze held her for a moment longer than it should have. She swallowed hard, trying to focus. "Special," she repeated, her voice steady. "What kind of special?" He hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting around the shop as if searching for the right words. "For someone who means a lot to me. I don't know what to get. Something that says everything." Without saying a word, Meera watched him closely. His eyes were a deep shade of brown, like the earth after a storm, but it was his expression that intrigued her. There was something familiar about the way he looked at her, as if he was searching for something he couldn't quite find, something just out of reach. "I think I have just the thing," Meera said softly, walking to a nearby shelf where she had already started arranging a bouquet. She chose a mixture of roses, peonies, and a few sprigs of lavender, her hands moving instinctively. She knew exactly what she needed to do. As she worked, she felt his eyes on her again, and she struggled to keep her focus. For some reason, this man was different. His gaze seemed to linger on her, almost as if he could see into her as she could see into others. But no. She couldn't let herself think that way. She had learned long ago that people were not to be trusted with the things she carried inside her heart. When she finished the bouquet, she placed it gently in his hands, her fingers brushing against his. A fleeting touch, but enough to send a quiet jolt through her. "Here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This should say everything you want." The man looked at the bouquet for a long time, his brow furrowing as if in deep thought. "It's beautiful," he said finally, his voice soft and almost reverent. But it wasn't the flowers he was looking at. His gaze had drifted back to her, lingering on her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. For a moment, Meera's breath caught in her throat. She could see it. The unspoken longing in his eyes. The wish that had been buried for so long, the yearning for something more, something that would fill the emptiness inside him. It wasn't love he sought, not in the traditional sense. It was redemption, a chance to fix something he had broken, something that had never quite been right. And in that moment, Meera realized that she knew him, or rather, she knew what he needed. Her fingers trembled slightly as she tied the bouquet with a simple ribbon, and she handed it over to him. "It will bring the message you wish," she said, her voice more distant than she intended. "But only if you allow it." The man blinked at her, as if her words had caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low, almost vulnerable. Meera gave him a gentle smile, masking the ache she felt inside. "The flowers will carry your message. But only if you speak it." He looked at the bouquet again, and for a moment, Meera thought he might say something else. Instead, he nodded slowly, as though he understood. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere, and for the first time, he met her gaze fully. For just a heartbeat, Meera could see the raw emotion in his eyes. The regret. The hope. And just for that moment, it felt as though he had peeled away the layers, revealing the man he truly was. Do you have a name?" he asked, a hint of curiosity now in his voice. Meera hesitated. She could have said anything. She could have given him a name that didn't weigh so heavily on her, one that was simply a mask she wore for the world. But something stopped her. Maybe it was his honesty, or maybe it was the silent understanding between them. She didn't know. Instead, she smiled, the weight of his gaze pulling at her in a way she hadn't expected. "Meera," she said softly. "Meera, the florist." His eyes seemed to soften as he nodded. "Meera," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "I'll remember that." For a moment, she wished he wouldn't. Wishes, after all, had a way of coming true in ways that hurt. As he walked out of the shop, the bell above the door chimed softly, and Meera stood still, her fingers resting against the counter. She didn't know why, but something in his presence had shifted something inside her. It wasn't love. No, it wasn't love. But it was something else. A connection, fleeting and fragile, like a petal drifting in the wind. She looked down at the flowers she had arranged, the ones that spoke to the hearts of others, but never her own, and wondered if perhaps, someday, her own heart might bloom. The door swung open again, but this time, it was only the wind. Meera turned back to her work, but something had changed. The scent of jasmine seemed a little less heavy. The roses seemed a little brighter. And somewhere, deep within her, she felt the first stirrings of a question: could her heart, too, learn to bloom?
Akumah Audiobooks.
Refer to the channel playlist for a better experience and close your eyes to let your imagination run wild. Subscribe.